Hi, welcome to the Global Grid Experience. As always, I am so happy you're here. I don't know about you, but it's easy for me to go off the rails with so much shit happening in the world. I'm big into mental health, and I'm super excited about my guest today, Tessa Wolden. She's going to talk with us about being grounded, centered, and living our authentic lives despite challenges. It's a skill and an art I really think is worth cultivating. Tessa Wolden is a board-certified art therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor with over 13 years of experience. She's recently launched her own private practice, Wind Wave Counseling, based in Edina, Minnesota. So let's begin. Hi, Tessa. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Erica?
Good. I'm good. Thank you. I'm so happy you're here, especially today because I feel a little cray-cray, and I think what you have to share is going to be valuable, not just to me, but to hopefully many listeners about grounding, being in balance, living our authentic lives. First, though, you combine therapy and a love of nature in your practice, which is an awesome combo. Can you tell us an experience that really instilled a love of nature within you?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely grew up as an outside kid, but, I don't think I really truly loved it until I had an opportunity to work up in the Boundary Waters, which is in northern Minnesota, a protected wildlife area with a bunch of lakes that are interconnected. And when I worked up there, it was just truly amazing to be basically like living outside. We had open air cabins and were camping, and just most of our time was spent outside. And that paired with living in community, being less self conscious of not having a lot of societal pressures, and also seeing people change. It really allowed me to love nature in a way that I had never had before, but have carried on with me since then.
Yeah, the Boundary Waters are amazing, aren't they? I mean,
Yeah,
incredible.
they're so beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. And we're working so hard to protect them and keep them as pristine as they are right now.
Yeah, the fact that they're even under threat is devastating.
It is.
But here we are fighting to protect, I think, one of the most beautiful places on the planet.
Exactly.
So what does incorporating nature into your practice look like?
Yeah. Because of that time working up in the Boundary Waters, it's a big reason why I actually became a therapist. And the fact that I loved seeing kids and teens come up into the wilderness area and seeing them grow so much over that time is part of why I became a therapist. And incorporating outdoors is something that I've always wanted to do in a variety of ways. In the past, I have mostly been doing it in the room in sessions, or whether virtually or in person. I often use nature as a metaphor because I think there's so much to be learned from nature. Sometimes in sessions in the inside can be just caring for the plants in my office or holding on to rocks as a way of like grounding ourselves or bringing ourselves closer to nature. A lot of times I give nature homework. I'm starting my own private practice, and I'm really excited to start to be able to have actual outdoor sessions, which can look so many different ways. It can be having your traditional talk therapy session, or I'm an art therapist as well. Art therapy session and just being sitting outside and having that. But sometimes it's, walking and being able to be active, which bilateral movement is really regulating to our nervous system. So, like any walking, riding your bike, running. But I think it also having it be a part of your therapeutic session can just allow you to notice the world around you more, have gratitude for the things that are natural in our world, and even kind of getting to that next level of caring for and having a reciprocal relationship with the natural world that we don't always get in our like industrialized society.
And so you touched on that a little bit, but why do you feel nature is important for our mental well-being?
Mm-hmm. I mean, evolutionarily, we're wired to be in nature. Like we used to live outside in nature all the time. And so there's been an abundance of research about spending time in nature and what it does to our bodies, especially as, like we were talking about, we're increasingly disconnected. And just for example, some of the research has shown it helps with resilience and self-esteem and social connectedness and senses of belonging. Those are all subjective things that people report from experiences outside, but there's also like hard evidence research around, like changes in cognition, reduction in cortisol, lowering of blood pressure, increased immune function from being outside. And one super like simple but really effective study just even looks at the difference between in hospital patients who have access to a window that looks out onto nature and how their stays in the hospital are days less in recovering than people who either don't have a window or have a window that doesn't look out at nature. But I think as far as our mental well-being, it goes beyond that in the fact that our society and world treats humans and nature as hierarchical and that humans are above nature. And I think that creates a lot of dissonance in our mental well-being. And I think some of being in nature is needed to realize that we're not any different than any other beings in nature and to reconnect with that world around us, especially in the sense that it can be really difficult to connect with other people, especially if you're struggling with your mental health, to connect with other humans. But there is always nature to be connected with, and connection in general, whether with human or nature, is a huge healing factor for our mental health.
You're an advocate for helping people to live balanced and authentic lives. How do we know if we're not in balance or living authentically? I mean, I know we can tell just by all of a sudden we're not feeling great, but I think it can be sneaky, and all of a sudden that becomes a norm.
Yes, absolutely. I think, society and culture is very driven and productivity focused. And it can be very easy to like get on that path or focus on those things. And it feels good. That's part of why it's been so appealing. But it can be easy to put off those things. I think especially nature, because it's not as easily accessed. But some of the ways that I see it coming up of not being balanced or living authentically is kind of when our boundaries have been pushed and we increase our resentment, which can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's just irritability and irritation. Sometimes that comes out as judgment or for other people or how they're living. And I think that goes back to needing to live true to whatever our values are to feel fulfilled. Because so often our society is goal oriented, which is the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. But living according to our values informs our goals, but is really an kind of like an undercurrent or is just kind of always there. And if we live true to those values, we can be fulfilled in those goals, but also just like throughout that. But I think it's really easy to lose sight of that. And this kind of goes into your next question around what do we do about that? Finding balance is never something that is completely done. It is something that requires constant readjustment and checking in. And sometimes that can be around journaling about our values or, like, are we living true to them or what are the barriers to doing that? Some of it can be done through meditation. I know it probably sounds like a broken record, but it's a broken record because it is so well researched and so effective in our ability to check in with ourselves, especially in our busy world. Especially, we're not always tuned into our bodies because we're in our thinking brain so much and anxious or just on to the next thing. And so meditation can be such a great way of gaining that felt sense of like, how am I doing? What is going on in my body? And that I think is one of the best ways of knowing if we're in balance or living authentically. For me, because I'm an art therapist and a visual person, I have certain kind of visuals that I think of when I'm meditating and finding my authentic self. For example, like in my chest and this like kind of small growing plant, and I can tell when it's like growing and when it's, struggling a bit. And another felt sense that I feel when I'm not living authentically or trying to pretend to be something that I'm not is like this anxious reaching kind of a sense in my body. But I have to stop and think about it in order to be able to do those things. In addition, for me, I think making artwork is such a great way to have that balance or even that checking in, because it allows us to do something and also like slow down a little bit or even be more intentional about that. For example, throwing pottery is a great way to find out kind of how you're doing. When I have done pottery classes in the past, throwing pottery, you have to be really grounded and present. And so if you're distracted, if you're doing anything else, if you're even just not feeling your best, it will be hard to throw pottery. I mean, unless you're a professional and you have like muscle memory. But like if you're an amateur like me, I could tell the days when I wasn't centered or balanced or just even in the right headspace.
How do we
Mm-hmm.
ground ourselves and make sure that we're grounded among all our challenges and busyness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like this is definitely a practice that we all need to do more of. There's literally the most simple grounding, having your feet or body on the ground, which is, where those words and language comes from. But all of it requires intention, because you can stand on the ground, but if you're not paying attention to it, it's not going to do anything. So it's really about that intention and attention around, okay, what do my feet feel like? Is the ground cold? What parts of my feet are touching? Are all of my toes touching the ground? Is there any pain? Is like if you don't have shoes on, is the grass wet or dry, or is it dirt and rock? All of that. So it requires intention and attention. Another really simple and very well known strategy, especially in the therapy world, is the five senses. And I literally use this like at least once a week. Okay. The process is using your five senses. It's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's five things that you see, which all of these things you can do inside, but is, I think, more rewarding outside and even more grounding. So, five things that you see, four things that you can touch or texture, three things that you can hear, two things that you can smell, and then one that you can taste. And you can't always identify all of those things, but it goes from your kind of most intense or acute senses to the ones that are sometimes more difficult. So, what happens in your nervous system when we are overwhelmed is that the front of our brain, the prefrontal cortex that does all of our problem solving and our critical thinking and even some of our like language and speaking, turns off, and we're just trying to survive, which was beneficial and is beneficial when we are in true survival situations. For example, when we were, you know, Neanderthals and trying to escape from a predator, we needed to not think and just do and like run away or hide or fight, which is that fight, flight, freeze response. But what ends up happening is that in our society today, we are constantly barraged by information or situations that ignite that fight or flight response. And when it's not really needed or helpful, and we never get a chance to reset. And so by doing these grounding practices, especially something like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you're getting that thinking brain, that prefrontal cortex back online. And so you're slowing yourself down, letting your body know and your nervous system know you're safe, and also getting that thinking brain back online by identifying, especially if you can name it out loud, naming out loud those different things. And so that can be incredibly beneficial.
The next thing I want to talk to you about is more of a deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any you can share with us about how to handle sadness when it comes to enjoying the outdoors? And I don't know if this applies to a lot of people, but I sometimes find myself avoiding the outdoors because I feel really depressed about all the shitty stuff we're doing to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I do not think you are alone in that at all. I think it is something that weighs heavily on a lot of us, especially it's that tricky difficulty of you want to be aware of what is happening, but also then is that getting in the way of your ability to regulate, like we've been talking about, but also just to enjoy. Brene Brown talks a lot about this difficulty around how enjoyment or joy can be a really vulnerable emotion. And sometimes we block that out because it feels so vulnerable. And then the reality is that joy and pain or sadness are really two sides of the same coin. And Brene Brown has a quote around like, we cannot selectively numb our emotions. So when we numb our pain, we also numb our joy. And so part of it is really embracing that sadness because it allows us to then feel the joy also. So it's holding the good and the bad at the same time, which we're not really programmed to do. Kind of going back to that survival and kind of inherent nature, our brains are programmed to look for the bad. That is how we survive. And so our brains instantaneously will categorize a threat or something that is bad, even if it's maybe like, oh, my friend didn't respond to my text. And we automatically are like, yep, our friends don't respond to our text. But there's been research that shows that it can take 30 seconds of a positive thought or memory or gratitude to be categorized kind of in the same way as that instantaneous negative. And so we don't want to be like a Pollyanna or like toxic positivity, but we do have to be intentional about the good holding alongside the bad to be able to hold both equally, and knowing that being able to hold that sadness is part of being human and having a human emotions and loving a place. And even though I think it makes sense to want to turn away, oftentimes the answer to that is the opposite of what you're wanting to do, especially when we're struggling sometimes with our mental health. There's a term or idea in DBT therapy, which is opposite action, where you do the opposite of what your brain sometimes tells you to do because you know that that's actually what you need, even if it feels uncomfortable. But it's about kind of embracing that discomfort. It's uncomfortable though, because we just want to feel that joy. It feels good and we love it. And that love is also why you feel that sadness.
Can you talk a little bit about environmental grief and any tips on how to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, really tough concept. And Joanna Macy has done or did do a lot of work. She unfortunately passed this last year, but she did a big chunk of her work is called The Work That Reconnects. That is a kind of a groundwork or series of workshops or actions that allow us to work through feeling that grief, but then move into action, which I think is really important. And she names environmental grief as the natural and compassionate response to the destruction of our planet and the suffering of its living systems. And that suffering piece, I think, is a really important part of it because when we think about the word compassion, it means to, especially if anyone has done, a lot of like Buddhist meditations, compassion is the idea of suffering with. And and the idea of compassion is that we have compassion for ourselves and others, not to take away the suffering or the pain, but to kind of ease any of the difficulties around it. And especially around like self compassion is recognizing the common humanity that is in there, which again goes back to that connection piece. We are all on this planet that is struggling. And also, I am not the only one who is worried about these things, and finding that community or common humanity. Another piece that I think can be beneficial around labeling the experience as environmental grief is that if you think about the whole variety of ways we experience grief, the idea around grieving is that we only grieve things that we love. There's no right way to grieve. So there's not a way that you're doing it right or wrong. And it's not something you can make go away, but it is something that we have to kind of not necessarily sit with, because you don't have to be passive about it, but like many other difficult emotions, allow it to pass through. And especially grief is not something that, like I said, goes away. So it's kind of like waves where like it will not always be there. There will be times when it gets really intense and there will be times when it goes away. But it's kind of when we fight against that or fight against the suffering is when things get really difficult. And so seeing that grief as really a form of love and moving through those feelings to the point of finding action, whether that is going to a rally or meeting up with an environmental group or even just stepping outside. It doesn't have to be big things. It can be really small things. Other thoughts around things that you can be doing is writing a letter to a place that you love, witnessing out loud, whether it's reading poetry about nature, naming what you see in a natural place, researching and saying out loud the research that you have found about a place that you love. And I think also even really looking towards a lot of our Native communities who have been grieving the loss of land and environment and a way of caring for the world around us, and seeing their, I think, wisdom and advocacy around our natural world.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we go?
Yeah, just two other resources I wanted to share, and I'm guessing that you could put it in your show notes, is so Joanna Macy's Work That Reconnects. They have a wonderful website that has a ton of different resources. You can connect with local or even online workshops around that grief and action work, or just working through some of those emotions. And then also climatementalhealth.net is a great resource as well. They have some really lovely visuals around language for climate grief, around just some of the experiences, or providing words for some of the things that we're experiencing, especially around the different kinds of grief that people or experiences people have around climate grief that can be, I think, really beneficial. And it allows us to, again, work through those emotions and also connect with others about what we're experiencing.
Yeah, I will definitely include those resources. Thank you so much for those. I'm definitely going to look into them. Well, Tessa, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Having this conversation, it's something I feel really passionately about, and I'm excited to see where things go with your podcast.
Thanks so much, Tessa.
That was Tessa Wolden from Wind Wave Counseling in Edina, Minnesota. Thank you, Tessa. And as always, thank you. I'm so grateful. For real. You can find more episodes at theglobalgridexperience.com or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at The Global Grid Experience if you want to reach out to me. Thanks so much for listening. Stay grounded out there. We need you. Hugs, my friends. Talk soon.